Good morning. I want to start by saying thank you for inviting me. This is a particularly special Sunday for me because I get to work with Mark, who has been part of the UU Hysterical Society for 8 years and been really supportive of us the whole way along. So it's particularly nice for me to be here this morning. I'm going to start with a story. Just as I was beginning seminary, my congregation moved into a new building. I was on the board at the time, and I was one of those general busybodies with her nose in everything. And so I was involved somehow in renovating the space to make it suitable for Unitarian Universalists. First and foremost, that meant removing the giant wooden cross from the front of the room. Now, if you're new, I need to clarify, UUs don't have a problem with crosses. We aren't vampires. This is a complex decision involving a nod to our heritage and often things that are really beautiful pieces of art and history. In the case of this cross, it didn't have any history with us, and it was not particularly beautiful, so the decision was a little bit easier. We decided it was a little more Jesus than our congregation was looking for on a weekly basis, and the cross had to come down. So the decision was clear, but in practical terms, it turns out wood is quite heavy. That phrase, cross to bear, not just a metaphor. Getting this thing off the wall was a feat of engineering and a near-death experience, and now what? The giant cross wouldn't exactly fit in the back of my minivan. It was going to need to be cut into pieces for transport. You can't use the power saw in the building, though. Sawdust flies everywhere, and the building committee had already told me no more power saws in the sanctuary. So this was the line of thinking that led me to a conversation with my friend Anne, who is a woman of great maturity and perspective. This is a sensitive time for your neighbors, Anne explained. With the loss of the old church that shrank down until they couldn't afford their building, your new neighbors are going to be grieving. But there's also this potential for connection, for inviting people in. And Liz, the community's introduction to Unitarian Universalism cannot be you taking a power saw to a cross on the lawn of the church. Anne has always been more touchy-feely than practical. I'm not sure in the end how the cross was removed. For some reason, they chose not to involve me any further. I think maybe someone had a woodworking shop where it became reclaimed wood, which is a whole wonderful metaphor I'd love to unpack. But in any case, it was gone. So here's the thing. It had hung there for many years, beside the huge vaulted window from which the light streamed down. And it's true what they say. Light really does transform everything it touches, particularly on a timescale of years. And so, sure enough, the paint around the cross had grown distinctly lighter, but the paint behind the cross had not. And so now, beside the pulpit, was a clear, stenciled outline. This could have been solved by repainting, of course, but in order to do that, we would have had to agree on paint colors. And the decorating committee pointed out that the colors couldn't be chosen until the fabric for the chairs that would replace the pews had been chosen. And the worship committee felt the pews couldn't be removed until we talked about how we embody our identity in the structure of our worship space, particularly when it comes to how we see religious authority, and so on and so on. For many months, we did not worship beside a giant cross. Instead, we worshiped beside the very conspicuous shadow that was cast by its absence. A giant, metaphorical, Jesus was here symbol stenciled above our heads. It was in more than one way, actually. It was on the literal wall, of course, but it's also in the conspicuous role that the Protestant tradition we come from plays in everything we do. It's in the tunes of the songs we sing, the piano accompaniment, the format of a sermon, the fact that we're meeting on a Sunday morning led by a professional in a building that's owned for that purpose. We've expanded our theology, but we embody it in the same way that we have for centuries. To me, the shadow of the cross on the wall on Sunday mornings was a physical manifestation of a structure that was frozen in time. It said, we have decided to do things differently, but we're not quite doing it yet because the details are still stuck in committee. So at around the time of this shadow of the cross business, I was feeling pretty stuck in committee myself. I was deeply in love with Unitarian Universalism and its values, and I was expressing that love by going to seminary, where we talked about this shadow of the cross stuff. We wouldn't have used that language, but we talked about the rapid pace of change in society and how we might be able to meet those changes. We talked about modern needs and how we might expand our structures to meet them. But we had those conversations in a university, mirroring the old ways of doing things with every detail of our structure, with all the expense that goes with academia and the inertia and the gatekeeping. And by approaching the issue from only that perspective, we were taking down the cross but continuing to function within the confines of its shape. I sucked at all of it. Even when I'm not critiquing the premise of school, I am a terrible student. Forcing my brain to study has always felt like trying to wrestle an active toddler into a car seat. I had long since received an ADHD diagnosis, which is the medical term for that active toddler car seat situation. And I had received medication and behavior suggestions, and of course all the messages that go with that. At the time, I saw myself as disordered and the wrong shape for academia. But I loved Unitarian Universalism, and I wanted to serve it. And this was how you did it. So I was determined to squeeze into the shape of what was being asked of me. Like, sometimes I was determined. On my good days, I was determined. On my less disciplined days, I would skip the books and the sermons we were supposed to be reading and watching, and I'd do what I loved to do, which was laugh. And I remember one day procrastinating on homework, watching these comedians on YouTube and thinking, wait a second. These guys, they're talking about the exact same ideas as the people in the books I'm supposed to be reading. Stand-up comedians tackle it all, big topics, tricky ones, religion, money, race, ethics. They do it in a way that's funny, though, and accessible, and easy to pay attention to. This was the beginning of a doorway in me. Maybe the fact that I had trouble paying attention to academia wasn't the flaw that made me a crappy minister, although I would have been a crappy minister had I chosen to do that. But maybe instead, this was the challenge that this challenge was something that would equip me to have conversations about all those same topics, but do it in other ways, ways that made space for people like me. The farther I moved from the powerless position of a grade school child, the more assertive that line of thinking became. I would sit in my school lectures now, and the usual messages would run through my mind. The problem is that I need to be better at paying attention. But now there was this little voice in my head that argued back, that argued, how come I always have to work harder to pay attention? What if I have been working as hard as I can to pay attention for years? How come he doesn't have to work any harder at being more interesting? Some other people have that same challenge. Also, when this stuff wasn't dry, it was not what I expected. I had always had these stories of UU history in my head, like Michael Servetus, the Unitarian martyr, chased and persecuted for his brave act of speaking the truth to John Calvin. It turns out, if you read Servetus' writings in his own words, well, he's very smart, he's very articulate, he's also really obnoxious. He doesn't just tell his truth, he stalks John Calvin. He writes him letters arguing every little point. He writes and distributes books. At one point, Calvin has a warrant out for Servetus' arrest, and Servetus goes to one of Calvin's talks and sits in the front row. He was like the worst type of internet troll before internet trolls were invented. Now, he didn't deserve what happened to him, of course. Nobody deserves to be burned at the stake. But after reading his actual words dripping with arrogance and condescension, there was a part of me that sympathized with Calvin's desire to get rid of him. I know that guy. I have chaired meetings containing that guy. Sometimes I've been that guy. He's the best of us in some ways and the worst of us in others. Or Emerson and Thoreau, that's another one. I had always admired the transcendentalists, how they forged these intentional, beautiful lives full of integrity. Learning a bit more about it, Thoreau could retreat to those woods to suck the marrow out of life because he was living on land that Emerson gave him for free. Where'd that land come from, Thoreau? And that story about how you're making the bold choice to live a simple life in the woods, I think we could say that Thoreau didn't invent that idea. Before Thoreau's people arrived, living simply was pretty much the only way anyone ever lived in those woods. Also, Thoreau went on long walks and wrote down his thoughts because he had all the time in the world, too. This whole system supported him in what he was doing. He had no kids to take care of. He had his free land. And we're pretty sure that Emerson's wife was doing his laundry. Louisa May Alcott, meanwhile, is living a few miles away, making all the same theological points about simplicity and intentionality and virtue in what would become her best-selling novel, Little Women. But she wrote in a way that wasn't academic. While her dad sat in the study talking philosophy with Thoreau and Emerson, he didn't work for much of Louisa's life, Louisa got to work writing. In a world not built for women to have a voice, she found a way to have one. In a world not built for women to earn, she found a way to feed her family with her voice, and she did all of that while doing her own laundry. So I'm sure you can hear my frustration a bit, and I wasn't the only one. We malcontents found each other and we bonded, and then we used our pent-up irritation and our esoteric knowledge to play witty and very historically specific pranks on each other. One time, some of our friends who ran the UU Housing Cooperative in Boston posted online that they were accepting applications for new roommates. A few of us applied as mostly dead, mostly Unitarians and Universalists. We applied as Emerson, listing Thoreau under pets. We applied as Michael Servetus. Under food allergies, we listed barbecue. It might be too soon. We applied as people we thought were missing from our mainstream history, too. Reverend Olympia Brown, for example, the first woman in the United States to be ordained. Dorothy Dix, whose tireless lobbying transformed conditions for institutionalized people in the United States and Canada and several other countries. These women's names aren't as well known as the ones I grew up learning, but when you line their lives up against Thoreau in the woods or Servetus writing his letters, you can't deny their stories deserve just as much acknowledgement. The Housing Co-op wrote back. They invited us for an interview, although they did caution us that some housemates may not have experience in living with the dead and may require education on matters of corporeal privilege. All this was followed by a week of messaging and coordinating and giggling and pranking that left me feeling warm and connected. Connected with my peers and with my UU heritage, gently poking fun at things I thought deserved to be knocked down a peg or two, and lifting up stories that aren't always told. The prank connected me with my values, too, as we coordinated to know just how far we could push things, keeping it funny for everybody. Above all, that prank left me feeling a part of Unitarian Universalism. We understood the shared jokes because they came out of shared values. I mean, corporeal privilege? How UU is that? This was a space that had room for me, where I didn't have to change shape to fit into a prescribed shadow. I didn't want it to end. So on a whim, I created a Facebook group and I named it the UU Hysterical Society. It's a play on the UU Historical Society, who have changed their name like twice since then, so nobody ever gets my joke. People usually just point out that the word hysterical has a troublesome history, used as a weapon to discredit and sometimes harm women. And they're right. Throughout history, the symptoms of hysteria have been very varied. Sometimes it was a woman who was struggling with what we would now call a mental illness or a disability. Sometimes it was a physical condition like epilepsy, or a life choice like deciding not to get married. Often it was a woman who was unable or unwilling to toe the line in some way. Sometimes it was a woman who was an awesome firebrand warrior pioneer of strength, too. Hysteria was this catch-all word for any woman who needed to be treated. A hysterical woman is a woman who is the wrong shape. And I, who was struggling so hard to fit into the shadow of the cross, I loved my UU Hysterical Society. It was an expression of my values. It was a space that fit me. And it was a break from that ministerial formation process at a time when that process was starting to break me. For years, I didn't think of it as anything more than my own personal refuge. By the time I clued in, we had about 20,000 members. Someone posted that she nearly drove her car off the road after spotting a UU church. She said she thought we were a joke religion made up for the purposes of the UU Hysterical Society. She said that seeing a real UU church was like spotting a unicorn. She almost drove her car off the road yelling, "They're real! They're real!" And I thought, wow, we might be telling 20,000 people about what Unitarian Universalism is. And then I thought, a word you can't say on Sunday morning, because what if we are telling 20,000 people what Unitarian Universalism is? I'm not the right person to lead that. I didn't finish the assigned reading. Fortunately, I didn't have to be the right person for that job. A religious educator named Kathy joined the team at about that time and was able to fill in some of my gaps. And together we stewarded the group as it continued to grow. And I toyed with the idea that maybe we should become something more, specifically maybe a legal entity that could apply for grants to help fund all of that extra work Kathy was putting in. But even thinking along those lines felt presumptive. Like, who did we think we were? It was not a rhetorical question. I had no idea who we were or why we were or what we were doing. And then in November of 2019, something happened that changed my perspective forever. My friend, Reverend Mbutendajimana, approached me for help raising money to settle a group of refugees. And so in November of 2019, the Hysterical Society held its first charity fundraiser. It was holiday themed because Christmas, refugees, that seems like an obvious connection. We sold PDFs with like labels for wine that said, "Hey, this was water a minute ago." We sold tags that said, "It's the thought that counts," and I way overthought this. We sold flasks that said, "For when thoughts and prayers are not enough," and "This is my spiritual practice," which is a pun in two different ways. And we raised more than $16,000. And on one of my trips with all these flasks to mail to the US, the post office guy said, "Okay, I'll bite. What is a hysterical society?" I didn't respond how I usually did when asked what I do. Normally, I mumble something like, "I run a Facebook group that makes fun of my religion." This is not a very accurate answer, but it usually ends the conversation. Instead, I lifted my head up and I grinned, and I answered with confidence and said, we were a group that was about joy and community and refugees. We had started gathering around laughter, which is a good in and of itself, like a soup kitchen for the soul. But we were slowly turning into more than that. We were still about laughter and community, and also about bringing dignity to people who deserve a chance to build a new life. The Canadian not-for-profit Mirth and Dignity was incorporated the following month. To this day, 100% of our profit from our online store, as well as our holiday fundraiser, goes to the charity that my friend founded. But most of what we do now is support for forms of UUism that are not supported by our traditional institutions. We started out with the UU Hysterical Society, then we added a board game ministry and a project on TikTok and a comedy podcast, most recently online soulful singing. I could go on about this. It is not an infomercial, though. You don't need this much detail, unless you share our vision of UUism beyond traditional structures, in which case you might want to become one of the people who supports us with a $5 a month pledge. Okay, now I'm done. For now, what I actually want to draw your attention to is the overarching arc of this story. That feeling of not quite fitting, which is, I find, a feeling that a lot of UUs can empathize with. Many of us became UU because we didn't fit into the communities we were born into. We figured out how to be diverse theologically, and I believe we are also right now in the process of creating structural diversity, a bunch of different ways to be UU. We have together inherited a shadow of a cross, a set of institutions and practices that define real religion, that don't fully work for modern communities. I've heard from people who feel like they're tired, they're trying to do too much, they feel focused on the wrong things. Many of our leaders are exhausted, and even our best efforts don't seem to be doing the trick. Maybe we don't need to work harder. Maybe we've already been working as hard as we can for years. What if this pressure doesn't mean what we think it does? What if we are not cracking because we're breaking, but because we're turning into something different? What if we lean into doing things differently and building something new? I don't know exactly where that would lead, any more than I had any idea where the prank in 2015 would lead. But I do know that the first step is to give ourselves permission to be who we are and who we're becoming, not who we were or who we think we're supposed to be. What would we do differently if we saw ourselves as hatching? What if it were an adventure? As the Leonard Cohen lyrics tell us so beautifully, ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There are cracks in everything. That's how the light gets in. Which I think is true, but it's also not the whole picture. The cracks are how the light gets in, sure. Sometimes, though, the cracks are also how the light gets out. The cracks are where the hatching starts.